From the outside, it's hard to know what's happening behind closed doors in the Roundhouse during the session. Everyone is so busy and things seem to change by the minute, if not faster. Our correspondent Gwyneth Dolan sat down with former New Mexico Senator Dede Feldman to gain some insight into what it's like to be a lawmaker. Ms. Feldman has a new book out titled Inside the New Mexico Senate: Boots, Suits, and Citizens.
Senator Feldman, thank you so much for being with us today. You were first elected in 1996. How long did it take you after that to figure out how the legislature really works?
Well, my first session was really a rocky one, and there was a big confrontation between the Democrats, who were in the majority in the Senate, and Governor Gary Johnson over prisons, private prisons, and gambling. This was also the year that gambling compacts were signed and then passed by the legislature. So I would say it took me 2 or 3 years to understand what was going on. And before that, I really felt a little bit like Alice in Wonderland. And people from the press would come and ask me what was going on, and I really wouldn't know. So I learned, though.
How different was that, being in the caucus meetings, being in committee meetings? How different was that for you as an insider from what you imagined it was like as an outsider?
Well, I really hadn't spent that much time at the New Mexico legislature before I was elected. I covered it once in the 80s as a journalist, and it was a mystery to me then. And so, I can see why it's a mystery to the general public. And that is why I wrote the book, because it shouldn't be an insider's game. I'm a big believer in transparency. And so I want to transmit whatever I know about how it works, sometimes how it doesn't work, to the general public. So they won't be as befuddled as I was.
What do you think are some of the things that are most confusing to the public?
Well, I think almost everything is confusing to the public. How a bill becomes law, who's in charge here, what are the ways that citizens can have input, is the place actually controlled by lobbyists and special interests? Who are these people? I think that those are some of the questions that run through the minds of the public. And when things are late, when committees don't run on time, and the sessions don't meet or declare sine die the minute they get back into town, it just gives the impression that the institution is dysfunctional. And it really isn't dysfunctional, but I think a lot of people believe that.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, our polling numbers when we look at approval ratings of the president and Congress are absolutely in the basement. And I think a lot of New Mexicans assume that these people are all crooks, that they don't know what they're doing, that they're not very smart, that they are looking after purely their own interests or those of campaign contributors. How far off from reality do you think our ideas are when we don't have the time and the ability to be a part of it?
Well, that's a big question, and I think the real polling data, the most recent polling data that we have about public impressions of the New Mexico legislature are from a Common Cause poll taken last year, and I think they're about ready to publish a new one. But at that time, it showed that 66% of the public believe that New Mexico elected officials are corrupt. 80% support disclosing all campaign contributions, and I think 87, or in the 80s somewhere, believe that campaign contributions should be limited. So what's giving a bad impression to the public is not how the legislature operates so much as how our campaigns are conducted. And I think that's what's giving people the impression that legislators are corrupt. And we have a citizen legislature, which not all states have. And that also opens up the possibility of conflict of interest. And I think that every once in a while there's a scandal about a legislator voting on something that is in his own pecuniary interest. And that's pretty common.
Because we have lawmakers who are real estate agents and lawyers and insurance salespeople. They're really involved in everyday industry, and they vote on things that affect those industries.
Absolutely. And they receive no salary from the legislature. And they have no full-time staff. Sometimes there's a dependence on lobbyists for information and for help with their constituents, which is not present in other states. So, you know, there are certain things about being a citizens' legislature, and, you know, and the cost of campaigns is so high that people wonder, why would anyone want to serve in the House or the Senate? But some of these
campaigns can be won with just a handful of thousands of dollars, can't they?
Yes, because of the way we have redistricted the seats in the New Mexico legislature. And it's the senators and the representatives who are drawing the lines and picking their own constituents rather than constituents picking them. And what that leads to, of course, is a huge number of safe seats and a very few number of competitive seats. So that, of course, leads to gridlock between the Democrats and the Republicans, whose only challenge really comes from a primary in their districts. So what do they want to do? They want to go to the edges. And this is really happening at a national level, less so in New Mexico, but I think it's true here as well.
And in terms of redistricting, the way that we have it done here by the legislature is different from the way it's done in some other places with an independent commission, things like that.
That's right, and that's one of the things I think we could do to improve the process, is to have an independent redistricting commission, to have an ethics commission to deal with some of these conflict of interest things that we talked about before, and also to consider paying the legislatures, or at least giving them a stipend, so that we would enlarge the pool of people who can serve. Remember, only those who can afford to subsidize their own service actually serve in the New Mexico legislature. And what that means is you get a great number of retired people, a great number of people in their 60s. It's not really a cross-section of New Mexico.
But some of the per diem payments that lawmakers get for travel during the session and for interim committee meetings can add up to $15,000, $18,000 a year.
That's true.
So would a payment be on top of or instead of those kind of per diems?
Well, I think there have been a number of different proposals made in the past for maybe a $10,000 stipend that would be administered by the Legislative Counsel Service, that could be used for expenses, for actual constituent service, for putting out a constituent survey, for hiring a secretary, maybe in common amongst all of the representatives and senators from a certain district, to solve constituent problems, more along the lines of what U.S. Congress people do now.
This session, the House will be controlled by Republicans for the first time in 60 years. How do you think that will change the dynamics in the Roundhouse?
Well, here's where I think it's very important to understand the history and kind of the structure of the New Mexico legislature. And we had Republicans in control in the House once before, but in 1953, during the Eisenhower administration. And they controlled the proceedings by one vote, and thus were able to control committees and leadership positions. 2 years later, the Democrats came back and controlled every seat in the New Mexico House except for 4. So there was a big turnover at that time. So things can change very quickly. That's one thing. And then also, we have to remember that the history of the New Mexico legislature is a history of coalitions, especially in the Senate, but also in the House, when for most of the 1980s, a cowboy coalition of Democrats and Republicans controlled proceedings there. So party affiliation is not everything. But you have to understand how the place works. And those who have the majority to elect the president pro tem of the Senate or the Speaker control the committees. And that's going to be very important in watching this session.
Senator Feldman, thank you so much for telling us more about the New Mexico legislature today.